Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Middle Ages. Everyone skips over the awkward parts, the unglamorous parts, the things that were so normal back then, nobody thought to write them down, which is honestly rude of them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Sleeping was never private. Tonight, you are not lying alone in a quiet room with the door closed. Instead, imagine yourself stepping slowly into a medieval house at the end of the day. The sun has already dipped below the horizon, not because it is late by modern standards, but because daylight ends early when there is no artificial light to extend it. The world outside has gone dim and uncertain. Inside, the house feels small, heavy, and alive with quiet sounds. The walls are thick but uneven. Smoke stains mark the ceiling beams. The floor is packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes that have been trampled flat over weeks or months. The air smells of soot, damp wool, old wood, and the remains of whatever meal was cooked before darkness fell. This is where you will sleep. In medieval Europe, for most people, sleep did not take place in a separate bedroom. It happened in the same space where cooking, working, eating, and social life occurred. The idea of a room dedicated only to sleeping was rare before the late medieval period and almost non-existent for peasants. Most households consisted of a single room. That single room did everything. As night approaches, the transformation begins. The table used for meals is pushed aside. Tools are leaned carefully against the wall. Cooking pots are stacked. Animals, often chickens, sometimes pigs or goats, settle into corners or stalls built into the structure itself. They are not there by accident. Their body heat helps warm the room. Firewood is added sparingly to the hearth. Wood is valuable, candles even more so. Light is dim and uneven, flickering across faces and walls. And then, one by one, people prepare for sleep. There are no individual beds lined neatly against walls. What exists instead are shared sleeping spaces. A wooden bed frame stuffed with straw, sacks filled with hay or dried leaves. Sometimes nothing more than thick blankets laid directly on the floor. These are not soft places. Straw shifts. Hay breaks down. Over time it turns to dust. Insects live inside it. Mattresses are rarely cleaned because cleaning them requires time, effort, and replacement materials. Sheets, if they exist at all, belong to wealthier households. Most people sleep directly under heavy woolen blankets that itch and smell faintly of the animals they came from. And these beds are shared. If you are a peasant family, parents and children sleep together. Young children often sleep closest to the adults, both for warmth and safety. Older children may sleep at the foot of the bed or on pallets nearby. Servants and apprentices sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Privacy is not expected. In fact, sleeping alone might be seen as unusual or even suspicious. Warmth matters more than personal space. During winter, body heat is one of the most reliable sources of survival. To sleep apart from others means risking cold, illness, and weakness. This arrangement extends beyond the household. When travelers arrive, space is made. Guests are offered a place to sleep often in the same bed. Refusing to share would be impolite. Medieval hospitality assumes closeness. Inns operate on the same principle. Records describe multiple strangers sleeping side by side in one bed, sometimes separated only by their clothing. Complaints exist, but they are not about sharing beds. They are about fleas, lice, snoring, or being forced onto the floor when no bed is available. Among the wealthy, the situation is different, but not as different as you might expect. Noble households have multiple rooms, but sleeping is still communal. Servants sleep nearby. Children often sleep in the same chamber as their parents well into adolescence. Guards remain close. Privacy is secondary to duty, protection, and warmth. Even royal beds are public spaces. Kings and queens receive visitors while seated or reclining in bed. Important political decisions are discussed there. The bed is a symbol of authority, continuity, and legitimacy. It is not a place of retreat. And then there is the nature of sleep itself. Medieval people do not sleep in one long, uninterrupted stretch the way you are encouraged to today. Instead, they practice what historians call segmented sleep. After nightfall, you go to bed early. Several hours later, you wake naturally. This first sleep ends without alarm clocks or artificial lighting. You wake because your body expects to. This wakeful period lasts 1 or 2 hours. During this time, people pray, reflect, talk quietly, tend the fire, check on animals. Sometimes they leave the house briefly. Court records mention people committing small crimes, visiting neighbors, or completing chores during these hours. Then comes the second sleep, lasting until dawn. This pattern appears repeatedly in medieval writings. It is so common that it rarely requires explanation. It is simply how night works. Imagine waking in the dark, surrounded by others. The room is quiet but not silent. Someone shifts. Someone coughs. The fire pops softly. Outside, wind moves through trees or presses against shutters. Sleep is communal not only in space, but in rhythm. Illness complicates everything. When someone becomes sick, they usually remain in the shared sleeping space. Isolation is rare. There is no spare room, no medical understanding of germs. People know illness spreads, but options are limited. This closeness helps explain how disease moves so quickly through households. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrive in straw mattresses and shared blankets. Itching is constant. Scratching is normal. And yet, people endure. Work during the day is exhausting. Farming, carrying water, chopping wood, weaving, cooking, cleaning, these tasks drain the body. By night, fatigue overwhelms discomfort. Sleep arrives because it must. As you lie there, pressed close to others, wrapped in rough cloth, listening to breathing rise and fall around you, you may begin to notice something important. Medieval sleep is not about comfort. It is about survival. The bed is not a personal refuge. It is a shared tool, like the hearth or the table. It exists to keep bodies alive through the night. And as the room settles into uneven stillness, you might wonder something quietly unsettling. If sleeping together was normal, if privacy was rare, and if solitude was almost unknown at night, what happened when someone desperately wanted to be alone? Wanting to be alone in a world with no privacy. As you lie there in the dark, pressed close to other bodies, the idea of being alone begins to feel distant. In the medieval world, solitude was not something easily obtained. It was not something most people expected to have, especially at night. Space was limited. Houses were small. Resources were shared. Life unfolded in full view of others, from waking to sleeping. And yet, medieval people were still human. They still felt embarrassment, desire, fear, grief, anger, weariness, the need to think quietly without being watched, the longing to rest without being touched by another elbow or foot. So how did people handle the desire to be alone in a world that offered almost no privacy? The answer is slow, imperfect, and deeply shaped by social rules. First, solitude was usually temporary, not spatial. You did not get a room to yourself. Instead, you found moments. Short windows of time when others were busy. Early mornings, late nights, trips outside. Tasks that allowed physical separation without social withdrawal. Fetching water, for example, was more than a chore. It was one of the few reasons to leave the house alone. A walk to the well or stream offered quiet, even if brief. Many medieval songs, poems, and court records hint at emotional conversations and private thoughts taking place during these errands. Likewise, tending animals, gathering firewood, or walking the edge of fields allowed space without drawing suspicion. These were acceptable reasons to be away. Inside the house, privacy relied on habit rather than architecture. Curtains might be hung around a bed, but these were rare outside wealthier homes. More often, people relied on darkness itself. Candlelight was limited. After the fire died down, faces disappeared into shadow. You could be awake without being seen. Sound mattered. People learned to move quietly, to speak softly, to signal boundaries through stillness rather than walls. If you did not want to be disturbed, you turned away. You stayed motionless. You pretended to sleep. This was understood. Social rules also dictated when privacy was allowed. Married couples were expected to share a bed, but even then, privacy was relative. Children might be nearby. Servants might be in the same room. Intimacy happened quietly, often under blankets, in darkness, with an awareness of others only feet away. This arrangement may seem uncomfortable to you, but it was normal. Shame operated differently. Bodies were familiar. Nudity, especially partial, was common during dressing, bathing, and sleeping. What mattered was behavior, not exposure. Unmarried adults followed stricter rules. Young men and women were often separated during sleep, even within crowded homes. Where separation was impossible, careful arrangements were made. Sleeping positions, clothing, and supervision mattered. Community reputation was fragile, and gossip traveled faster than written records. Being alone with the wrong person could damage a family's standing for generations. For religious communities, solitude took on a different meaning. Monks and nuns often slept in communal dormitories, sometimes dozens in a single space. Silence was enforced. Beds were narrow. Personal possessions were minimal. Even here, privacy was rare. Solitude was spiritual, not physical. True isolation was associated with hermits and anchorites, people who withdrew from society entirely. These figures were respected but also feared. Living alone was seen as extreme, even dangerous. Most people did not aspire to it. In everyday life, constant presence shaped behavior. You learned to regulate emotions quietly. Public displays of grief or anger were controlled. Tears might be shed at night, silently, with a blanket pulled over the face. Fear was common. Darkness brought uncertainty. Without locks or secure doors, the night was vulnerable. Sleeping near others provided comfort and protection. A group could respond quickly to danger, fire, intruders, animals. This safety outweighed discomfort. Children grew up without ever knowing what it meant to have a bedroom of their own. They learned early how to sleep through noise, how to ignore movement, how to share space without complaint. Adults adapted in the same way. Over time, these habits shaped the medieval understanding of self. Identity was communal. You belonged to a household, a village, a network of obligations. Being alone was not a right. It was a deviation. And yet, cracks appear in the records. Court cases mention arguments sparked by sleeping arrangements, complaints about overcrowding, disputes between servants over bed space, occasional references to individuals seeking separate sleeping quarters when wealth allowed. By the late medieval period, especially among the urban middle class, changes begin. Houses grow slightly larger. Specialized rooms appear. The concept of a bedchamber develops. Curtains become more common. Beds become more personal. Privacy slowly gains value. But this change is uneven and slow. For most people, shared sleep remains the norm well into the early modern period. What does this constant closeness do to a person? It creates resilience, certainly. People learn patience, tolerance, awareness of others. But it also creates tension, suppressed desires, quiet frustrations that have nowhere to go. You can imagine lying awake during the first sleep, listening to breathing around you, aware of thoughts you cannot speak aloud, dreams blending with reality, the sense that your inner world belongs only to you, even if your physical space does not. This is perhaps the most important distinction. Even when bodies were shared, thoughts were not. Medieval people carried private fears and hopes silently. They prayed internally, reflected quietly, imagined futures they might never speak of. And as sleep returned for the second time, wrapping the room in heavy stillness, you might begin to wonder how this shared way of sleeping shaped relationships, families, and emotional bonds over generations. If people spent every night so close to one another, how did it change the way they loved, argued, forgave, or remembered? And what happened when this ancient pattern of sleep slowly began to disappear? When privacy slowly arrived, and what was lost? If you stay in this medieval house long enough, something subtle begins to shift. At first, sleep feels like a purely physical act. Bodies pressed together, warmth shared, noise endured. But over generations, something changes, not in how people sleep, but in how they think about sleeping. Privacy, once barely imaginable, slowly becomes desirable. This transformation does not happen suddenly. There is no moment when medieval people wake up and decide they want their own rooms. Instead, the change unfolds quietly, alongside other changes that seem unrelated at first. Urban growth, rising incomes, new building styles, and shifting ideas about the self. By the late Middle Ages, towns are growing. Merchants, craftsmen, and administrators form a new social group. Not peasants, not nobles, but something in between. These households begin to build larger homes, often with multiple rooms stacked vertically. Space becomes negotiable. A separate sleeping chamber is no longer impossible. At first, it belongs only to the head of the household, then perhaps to a married couple. Children still sleep together. Servants still sleep nearby. But the idea has been introduced. The bed begins to change. Instead of straw-filled sacks, mattresses become more structured. Feather beds appear among the wealthy. Sheets become more common. Beds acquire frames, curtains, and canopies, not only for warmth, but for separation. Curtains are important. They do not create true privacy, but they signal it. Drawing a curtain becomes a request. Do not look. Do not interrupt. Even in a shared room, a boundary has been placed. This is new. As beds become more personal, sleep becomes more individualized. The bed is no longer just a household resource. It becomes an extension of the person. And with this shift comes a change in emotional life. People begin to associate sleep with inner experience, dreams, thoughts, restfulness, rather than simply recovery from labor. Diaries and letters from the later medieval and early modern periods include reflections on sleep quality, nightmares, and restlessness. Something that was once routine becomes meaningful. Segmented sleep also begins to fade. Artificial lighting slowly improves. Candles become more accessible. Oil lamps become more efficient. Evening activities extend later into the night. The natural rhythm of first sleep and second sleep is disrupted. People stay awake longer. Eventually, they begin sleeping in one longer stretch. Waking in the middle of the night becomes a problem rather than a normal pause. This change is gradual, but its impact is profound. Sleep moves inward. It becomes private, psychological, personal. By the early modern period, sleeping alone, once strange, becomes aspirational. Especially among the upper classes, privacy is now associated with refinement, morality, and self-control. Sharing a bed with strangers becomes suspicious. Sleeping alone becomes respectable. What was once practical now feels invasive. But something is lost along the way. When medieval people slept together, they shared vulnerability. Illness was visible. Fear was collective. Nighttime dangers were faced together. Comfort came from presence, not isolation. Children grew up surrounded by breathing bodies. They learned security through proximity. Loneliness, at least at night, was rare. As privacy increases, isolation follows. Bedrooms become separate. Doors close. Silence replaces communal noise. Sleep becomes quieter, but also lonelier. This shift reshapes family relationships. Parents and children no longer sleep in the same space. Emotional distance grows subtly. Adolescence becomes more defined. Authority becomes less visible at night. Marriage changes too. Intimacy becomes hidden rather than negotiated within a shared environment. Expectations shift. Desire becomes more private and more complicated. By the time modern sleep habits are established, the medieval world of shared beds is almost unimaginable. You are taught to sleep alone. Darkness is total. Silence is enforced. Any interruption feels wrong. Waking at night is labeled a disorder. And yet, traces remain. You still fear sleeping alone in unfamiliar places. You still find comfort in presence. Pets, partners, background noise. Complete silence feels unnatural to many people. This is not a coincidence. For most of human history, sleeping alone was rare. The medieval period was not unusual in this regard. It was typical. Only recently has solitude become the norm. When you struggle to sleep, when you wake at night for no clear reason, when your body resists uninterrupted rest, you may be experiencing echoes of an older rhythm. The medieval night lingers quietly inside you. As you imagine leaving that medieval house for the last time, stepping out into the cold air just before dawn, you realize something important. The past did not sleep the way you do, and perhaps, in some small ways, neither do you. Sleep has never been just about rest. It reflects how people live, work, love, and understand themselves. The medieval bed, crowded, noisy, shared, was not a failure of comfort. It was a solution to a different world. And as that world faded, new problems quietly took its place. So as you lie alone tonight, wrapped in blankets, separated by walls and doors, you might ask yourself one final question. Have we truly improved the way humans sleep? Or have we simply traded warmth and togetherness for silence and distance? What shared sleep taught people about living together? If you step back even further, beyond individual houses and households, you begin to see that medieval sleep was not only a private habit or a domestic arrangement. It was part of a much larger social system. The way people slept shaped how they understood trust, obligation, and belonging. In a world where everyone slept together, you learned very early that your body was not entirely your own. It belonged, in part, to the household. Your warmth mattered to others. Your movements affected them. Your illness threatened them. Your rest was tied to their survival. This created a constant awareness of interdependence. You could not pretend that you lived alone. Even at night, even in dreams, you were part of a group. The boundary between self and others was thinner, softer, and more flexible than it is today. This had consequences. One consequence was tolerance. Living so closely required patience. You learned to endure snoring, coughing, shifting bodies, restless children, and animals moving in the dark. Complaining did little good. Endurance became a quiet virtue. Another consequence was accountability. If you woke someone by accident, you apologized. If you brought lice into the bed, it affected everyone. If you stayed out late and disrupted sleep, it was noticed. Nighttime behavior was social behavior. There was no private escape from responsibility. This closeness also shaped memory. Medieval people did not fall asleep alone with their thoughts sealed off. Stories were told at night. Prayers were spoken aloud. Children heard adult conversations they were not meant to fully understand. Fear, hope, and uncertainty were shared experiences. The night became a collective archive. In times of crisis, this mattered deeply. During famines, families slept closer together to preserve warmth. During plagues, the sick often remained among the healthy, not out of ignorance alone, but because separation was logistically and emotionally difficult. People faced death together, even in sleep. Court records and wills reveal how common it was for individuals to remember dying beside others, holding hands, or sharing a final night in a familiar bed. Death did not usually happen in isolation. It happened in rooms full of witnesses. This shaped medieval attitudes toward mortality. Death was not hidden behind hospital walls. It arrived at night, among family, in shared spaces. Children grew up seeing it. Fear existed, but so did familiarity. When privacy slowly increased in later centuries, death moved away from the bed and into specialized spaces. Hospitals, institutions, separate rooms. The emotional distance grew. But in the medieval world, sleep, sickness, and death were woven together. The bed was the center of life's beginning, middle, and end. This is why beds appear so often in medieval legal documents. Beds were valuable property. They were inherited, sold, listed in wills. A good bed represented stability. It meant survival through winter. It meant status. It meant continuity. To lose your bed was to lose security. Even laws reflect this importance. In some regions, beds could not be seized to repay debt, because doing so would endanger life itself. A bed was not a luxury. It was essential infrastructure. As society slowly moved toward individual sleeping spaces, something fundamental changed in how people related to one another. Privacy brought comfort, but it also allowed avoidance. You could withdraw. You could hide distress. You could suffer alone without witnesses. You could fall ill without immediate support. You could disappear into your room. These developments were not inherently negative. They enabled autonomy, reflection, and psychological space. But they also weakened nightly communal bonds. In medieval households, you could not easily pretend that everything was fine. Your exhaustion showed. Your fear was audible. Your grief disturbed others' sleep. Care was enforced by proximity. As you move forward in time, you see echoes of this loss in modern concerns. Loneliness, insomnia, anxiety at night. Many people today sleep surrounded by silence, yet feel unrest. They seek substitutes, background noise, white noise machines, recorded voices, podcasts, audiobooks. In a way, you are doing something similar now. Listening to a calm voice describe history as you fall asleep is not so different from lying in a medieval house. Hearing someone speak softly in the dark while others breathe nearby. It recreates presence. It reminds the nervous system that it is not alone. This is perhaps the most unexpected legacy of medieval shared sleep. Not the discomfort, not the lack of privacy, but the deep human preference for companionship during vulnerability. As you imagine the medieval night one last time, the low fire, the rough blankets, the uneven breathing, you may notice that the scene no longer feels strange. It feels distant, yes, but not alien. The medieval bed was not backward or ignorant. It was adapted to its world. It solved problems that no longer exist and created constraints that we no longer accept. And yet, the human body remains much the same. It still wakes at night. It still seeks reassurance. It still listens for signs of safety before letting go. When you close your eyes tonight, alone in your room, you may carry with you faint traces of centuries of shared sleep. Not as nostalgia, but as memory embedded in biology. And that raises a final, quiet question worth resting with. If humans evolved to sleep together, and history shows that we did so for most of our existence, what does it truly mean to sleep well? A day shaped by buckets and distance. Before you do anything else in the morning, before work, before food, before prayer, there is one task that quietly controls your entire day. You need water. In the medieval world, water is not something that waits for you behind a wall or inside a pipe. It does not arrive with a twist of the wrist. It does not flow endlessly, cleanly, or reliably. You go to it, and you do so again and again. If you live in a village, the nearest water source may be a well, a stream, a spring, or a river. The distance varies. Sometimes it is just outside the house. Sometimes it is several minutes away. Sometimes it is far enough that the journey itself becomes the defining rhythm of your life. Water is heavy. A full bucket can weigh more than 20 kilograms. Carrying it requires strength, balance, and time. Spilling it means wasted effort. Dropping it can mean injury. And yet, water is needed constantly. You need it to cook, to drink, to clean, to wash tools, to rinse grain, to water animals, to put out fires, to tend the sick, to prepare the dead. There is no single daily trip. There are many. Fetching water is rarely mentioned in heroic histories. Kings do not fetch water. Battles are not won by buckets. Chronicles pass over it in silence. But if you were alive in the medieval period, this task would shape your body, your schedule, and your social world more than almost anything else. The responsibility usually falls to women and children. This is not accidental. Men are often assigned to field labor, construction, or travel. Women remain closer to the household. Children assist where strength is limited but time is abundant. From a young age, you learn the route to the water source. You learn how to balance the bucket. You learn where the ground is uneven, where mud forms after rain, where ice gathers in winter. You learn patience. In many villages, water sources are shared. The well becomes a social center. People wait their turn. Conversations happen there. Arguments begin there. News spreads there. This is one of the few times during the day when people gather without working the land. But it is not leisure. You are aware of the line behind you, of the wait that awaits you on the way back, of the meals that cannot begin until water arrives. If the well is deep, drawing water is slow. Rope burns your hands. Buckets creak. Sometimes the rope snaps. Sometimes the bucket falls and is lost. Replacing it is expensive. In dry seasons, water levels drop. The wait grows longer. Tension increases. Rules are enforced more strictly. Who draws first matters. Water access is power. In towns, the situation is different, but not easier. Urban water often comes from public wells, fountains, or rivers. These sources are crowded and often contaminated. Waste flows downhill. Tanneries, butchers, and workshops pollute streams. Clean water requires careful selection of source and timing. Some cities build aqueducts or conduits, but maintenance is uneven. Pipes leak, channels clog, supplies fail. Even in cities with advanced infrastructure, households still carry water manually. It must be lifted, transported, stored, guarded. Storage matters. Water is kept in barrels, jugs, and tubs. These containers must be cleaned. Left standing too long, water becomes foul. Algae grows. Insects breed. Drinking water is often mixed with ale or wine, not always for pleasure, but because fermentation kills some contaminants. Even children drink weak ale. Pure water is risky. Medical theory of the time associates water with imbalance. Too much cold and wet humor is believed to cause illness. Drinking water straight is sometimes discouraged. And yet, thirst exists. During heat, during labor, during sickness, water is needed urgently. People know when their bodies require it, even if theory disagrees. In winter, fetching water becomes dangerous. Paths freeze. Buckets slip. Streams ice over. Wells become harder to draw from. Water must sometimes be broken free with tools. Cold air burns the lungs. Fingers go numb. Spilled water freezes on clothing. Still, the task continues. If you are sick, someone else must fetch water for you. If no one does, you suffer. This dependency shapes social bonds. Neighbors help each other. Households trade favors. Refusing water is unthinkable. During famine or siege, water becomes more valuable than food. Cities under siege often fall not because of starvation, but because water runs out or becomes poisoned. Wells are targeted. Rivers are diverted. Cisterns are guarded. Water determines survival. For ordinary people, however, the struggle is quieter. You wake knowing that your first major physical effort will be carrying water. You plan meals around availability. You ration carefully. Waste is avoided. Bathing is limited not only by belief, but by cost. Washing clothes is labor-intensive. Every rinse requires another bucket. Fire is an ever-present threat. Without water nearby, a single spark can destroy an entire street. Buckets are kept ready. Community drills exist. Everyone knows their role. This constant attention to water creates a mindset of conservation. You do not let water run unused. You reuse it. Wash water becomes cleaning water. Cleaning water becomes animal water. Nothing is wasted. And yet, despite all this effort, you are never fully secure. A drought changes everything. A flood contaminates sources. A broken well halts life. Illness spreads through shared water faster than anyone understands. There is anxiety in this dependence. You know that tomorrow will require the same effort, and the day after that, and the year after that. There is no end. As you imagine carrying a bucket along a familiar path, feeling its weight pull at your arms, your steps careful and slow, you begin to understand how something so ordinary could dominate existence. History remembers kings and wars, but most medieval lives were shaped by how far they had to walk for water. And as you set the bucket down at the door, catching your breath, you might begin to wonder something quietly unsettling. If so much of life was spent just bringing water home, what happened when the water was no longer there? When water was scarce, dangerous, or suddenly gone? If daily life in the medieval world was shaped by water, then crisis arrived when that water became uncertain. Scarcity did not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it began quietly, with a well that took longer to fill a bucket, or a stream that ran thinner than usual. At first, people adjusted without complaint. They rose earlier. They waited longer. They carried less, but returned more often. Water shortage was not unusual. Medieval communities expected it. Rain did not follow schedules. Winters froze sources solid. Summers dried them out. Entire villages lived at the mercy of weather patterns they could not predict or control. And when scarcity arrived, the burden fell hardest on those already exhausted. Fetching water took more time. Paths grew crowded. Tempers shortened. Small disagreements at the well became serious conflicts. Who had the right to draw first? How much was too much? Who was wasting? Communities responded with rules. Many villages and towns established strict regulations governing water access. Certain hours were assigned. Certain groups were prioritized. In some places, fines were issued for drawing water outside permitted times or for washing clothes at drinking sources. Water was not free in practice, even if it was free in theory. In towns, scarcity mixed with contamination. Urban water sources were notoriously dangerous. Waste flowed downhill, and downhill often meant into rivers and streams. Tanneries soaked hides in foul chemicals. Butchers dumped remains. Dyers released pigments. Human waste drained into open channels. People knew this water was dangerous, even if they did not understand bacteria. They judged water by taste, smell, and appearance. Clear water was preferred. Flowing water was safer than standing water. Wells were protected carefully. Cisterns were covered. Still, illness spread. Dysentery, diarrhea, and fevers were common. Children suffered most. Dehydration weakened the body quickly. Without modern medicine, survival depended on rest, luck, and care. During outbreaks, water became both cure and threat. People boiled it when fuel allowed. They mixed it with alcohol. They prayed. They blamed bad air, corrupted humors, or divine punishment. What they did not blame, germs, continued to act unseen. In rural areas, danger arrived differently. Streams flooded. Wells collapsed. Landslides buried springs. In winter, ice made paths impassable. Carrying water became a risk to life itself. Falls were common. Broken bones could mean death. Cold exposure weakened immune systems. Yet water still had to be fetched. Pregnant women carried buckets. Elderly people tried not to spill. Children struggled under loads too heavy for their frames. There was no alternative. When water truly disappeared, desperation followed. Historical records describe villages abandoned after wells failed. Entire communities relocated closer to rivers or more reliable springs. Land that had been settled for generations was left behind because water access changed. Water determined geography more than borders. During sieges, water scarcity became a weapon. Attackers poisoned wells with carcasses. Defenders rationed fiercely. Cisterns were guarded day and night. Panic spread faster than hunger. People could survive weeks without food. Without water, only days. In these moments, social order strained. The strong took more. The weak depended on mercy. Authorities enforced discipline harshly. Theft of water was punished severely. Yet even then, cooperation often prevailed. Buckets were shared. Lines were formed. Children were prioritized. Religious rituals were held to ask for rain or protection of springs. Water became sacred. Wells were blessed. Springs were associated with saints. Offerings were made. Belief provided comfort where control did not exist. For ordinary people, the emotional weight of water scarcity was constant. You went to sleep wondering if the source would hold tomorrow. You woke early to check levels. You worried about illness. You worried about fire. You worried about animals. Anxiety became routine. And yet, life continued. People adapted. They learned which sources failed first. They memorized seasonal patterns. They taught children how to conserve. Scarcity shaped habits deeply. You drank slowly. You avoided waste. You learned to endure thirst longer than you should. These habits carried forward even when water was available. They became part of character, part of culture. Even when rains returned, the memory of shortage lingered. As you imagine standing at a well during a dry summer, lowering the bucket again and again, listening for the sound of water far below, you begin to understand that water was never just a resource. It was uncertainty made visible, and that uncertainty shaped how medieval people thought about the future itself. If tomorrow's water could vanish without warning, how could anyone truly feel secure? How carrying water shaped bodies, minds, and the future. If you watch medieval people long enough as they fetch water day after day, you begin to notice something subtle. Their bodies adapt. Shoulders slope forward slightly from years of bearing weight. Hands become thick-skinned and strong. Balance improves. Steps grow careful and economical. Movements are practiced, almost automatic. Fetching water is not exercise chosen for health. It is labor imposed by necessity. And yet, it shapes the human form just as surely as farming or construction. Women who carried water daily often developed extraordinary endurance. Children learned strength earlier than their years suggested. Aging bodies slowed, but did not stop. As long as someone could walk, they could carry something. This physical adaptation came with a mental one. Medieval people learned to think in quantities and limits. How much water is left? How many buckets remain before nightfall? How much can be spared for washing? How much must be saved for animals? These calculations ran constantly, often without conscious thought. Water was never abstract. It was measured in weight, distance, time, and effort. You felt its cost in your muscles and joints. You knew exactly how much work went into every drop. This awareness shaped attitudes toward waste, abundance, and entitlement. To waste water was not just careless. It was immoral. It disrespected labor. It endangered survival. Social pressure reinforced this belief. Children were scolded. Adults were judged. Cleanliness, too, was understood differently. Bathing was not avoided because people disliked cleanliness. It was avoided because it was expensive and effort. Washing clothes required planning. Full-body bathing was rare, often reserved for special occasions, illness, or ritual. Despite later stereotypes, medieval people did care about hygiene. They washed hands and faces. They cleaned wounds. They maintained basic standards, but they did so within limits set by labor. Water availability defined cleanliness. This reality also shaped social inequality. Households closer to water sources had advantages. Urban elites sometimes paid others to carry water for them. Monasteries and castles invested heavily in water infrastructure. Pipes, cisterns, wells, because they could. For the poor, distance meant hardship. Carrying water up hills or stairs added invisible labor to daily life. In crowded cities, climbing narrow staircases with buckets became routine. Spills meant starting over. These differences mattered. Over time, access to water became a marker of status. Not just ownership, but proximity. Clean water nearby signaled stability and privilege. This is why medieval urban planning, when it existed, revolved around water. Streets followed drainage patterns. Markets clustered near wells. Churches were often built near reliable sources. Water organized space. It also organized time. Days were structured around water needs. Morning trips, midday refills, evening preparation, fire safety at night, festivals, work schedules, and even prayer times adjusted to water availability. During drought, entire rhythms shifted. This constant negotiation with nature shaped medieval attitudes toward control. People understood that some things could not be mastered. You could dig wells. You could build channels. But you could not command rain. This bred humility or resignation. Religious belief filled the gap. Water was associated with divine favor or punishment. Rain was prayed for. Springs were blessed. Saints were invoked. Faith provided meaning when effort was not enough. As centuries passed, technology slowly changed the equation. Better wells, improved pumps, aqueducts restored and expanded. Eventually, pipes entered private homes. But these developments were uneven and slow. For most people, for most of medieval history, water remained heavy and distant. When modern plumbing finally arrived, it transformed daily life more radically than most political revolutions. Fetching water disappeared almost overnight. The labor vanished. The calculations faded. Waste became possible. Cleanliness standards rose sharply. Bathing became frequent. Water lost its physical weight, and with it, some of its emotional weight. You no longer feel water in your shoulders. And because you do not feel it, you may not value it in the same way. Modern people often struggle to understand why medieval communities made the choices they did. Why they bathed less. Why disease spread. Why cities smelled. Why fires were devastating. The answer is simple and deeply unglamorous. Water was hard to move. Every historical decision sits on top of that fact. As you imagine setting down the bucket one final time, arms aching slightly, knowing you will need to repeat the task tomorrow and the day after that, you begin to understand something important. Medieval life was not defined by ignorance or indifference. It was defined by effort, and that effort shaped values that are easy to lose when water flows freely. Even today, when droughts occur, when infrastructure fails, when disasters disrupt supply, modern societies rediscover this truth quickly. Panic sets in. Lines form. Rules appear. Conservation becomes moral again. For a brief moment, the medieval mindset returns. Water reminds us of dependence. And as you lie quietly now, listening rather than carrying, resting rather than calculating, you may find yourself reflecting on a final question. If so much of human character was shaped by the daily struggle to secure water, what parts of ourselves have quietly changed now that the buckets are gone? When water finally became invisible. At some point, long after the medieval period has faded, something remarkable happens. Water disappears, not from the world, but from awareness. Pipes are buried underground. Pumps work quietly. Faucets deliver water instantly, cleanly, and in quantities so large that most people stop thinking about limits altogether. The daily journey ends. No more buckets. No more aching shoulders. No more planning meals around how much water remains in the house. No more anxiety about whether the well will run dry tomorrow. For the first time in human history, large populations live as if water is endless. This change is so complete that it becomes difficult to imagine how life ever worked differently. But for medieval people, this would have felt like magic. If you could explain modern plumbing to someone who spent their life fetching water, the most astonishing part would not be cleanliness or comfort. It would be reliability, the certainty that water would be there every time. That certainty did not exist for them. In the medieval world, every day began with a question mark. Will the source hold? Will the path be safe? Will the water be clean enough? Will there be enough for everyone? Those questions shaped psychology. People developed patience not because they were naturally calm, but because impatience solved nothing. Waiting was unavoidable. Effort was unavoidable. Repetition was unavoidable. Modern life removes much of that repetition, and with it, something subtle changes in how time feels. Medieval days were long not because clocks measured them differently, but because effort stretched them. A single task could occupy hours. Fetching water was not a background activity. It was an event. Now, the same task takes seconds. Time compresses. This compression affects memory. Medieval people remembered water sources vividly. They knew their depths, their moods, their seasons. Springs had personalities. Rivers were dangerous or kind. Wells were trusted or feared. Water had character. Modern water does not. It is uniform, anonymous, odorless, tasteless, interchangeable. It arrives without story. And because it arrives without story, it leaves without notice. Waste becomes easy. Leaving a tap running feels insignificant because the effort behind that water is invisible. You do not feel the weight in your arms. You do not feel the distance in your legs. The medieval person would have felt it immediately. This invisibility changes moral relationships. When effort disappears, value shifts. Conservation becomes optional. Scarcity feels abstract. Responsibility moves away from individuals and into systems. And systems, when they fail, fail suddenly. When modern water systems break, through disaster, war, neglect, or climate stress, societies react with shock. Panic sets in quickly. People line up for bottled water. Rules are enforced. Tempers flare. In those moments, history returns. The medieval logic reappears almost instantly. Water becomes precious. Carrying it becomes labor. Waste becomes immoral again. People relearn lessons their ancestors never forgot. This suggests something important. The medieval experience of water was not primitive. It was intimate. They lived close enough to necessity to understand it deeply. They did not romanticize it. They endured it. That endurance shaped culture. Songs, rituals, laws, and beliefs formed around water because water shaped survival. Even language reflects this. Blessings, curses, metaphors, all draw from water's unpredictability. Dryness meant danger. Flow meant life. By the end of the medieval period, as infrastructure improved, water slowly retreated from daily consciousness. But the transition was uneven. Many communities carried buckets well into the modern era. For them, history did not change all at once. It faded gradually, step by step, trip by trip. And even now, large parts of the world still live closer to the medieval experience than to the modern ideal. Fetching water remains a daily reality for millions. The weight, the distance, the planning, all still exist. History, in that sense, is not evenly distributed. As you imagine the medieval water carrier one last time, walking a familiar path, adjusting grip, steadying breath, you may realize that their life was not defined by hardship alone. It was defined by rhythm. Fetch, carry, use, return. That rhythm created structure in a world with few guarantees. It gave shape to days, weeks, and years. When that rhythm disappears, life becomes easier, but also less anchored. Modern people often search for structure through schedules, apps, reminders, routines. Medieval people did not need to search. Water provided it automatically, and that leaves one final, quiet question worth considering as you rest. If so much meaning, discipline, and awareness came from daily effort. What happens to a society when the effort is removed, but the need for meaning remains?